You're listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks, your source for centered and focused play therapy coaching.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brenna Hicks, and this is the Play Therapy Podcast. So last episode, we talked about the why behind using empathic responses and the reflective responding skills. So today we're jumping into what those responses actually look and sound like. So I think it's really important to note there are many different ways that these have been referred to in literature. So sometimes you get reflective listening, sometimes you get reflective responding, sometimes you get active listening, sometimes you get empathic responses, listening skill. So you'll hear this phrased a lot of different ways. That only matters in the sense that I'm going to combine all of those different terminologies and I'm going to just call it reflective responses because that's Landreth's terminology and that's what I'm used to. So just know that in different authors and in different literature, you will see that referred to in different ways, but it all is essentially the same thing. It's when the therapist is communicating to the child that I'm present and I'm telling you what I see happening in a variety of different ways. So let's talk through some of the ways that this works. So the reflective responses, there are three options. So I'm going to go through each one individually, but then I'm going to show you how at any given moment you can use all of them. You don't need to, you can pick one, but you could theoretically use all three at any given moment, depending on what's happening in the playroom. So let's start with reflecting feeling. You, emotion, very simple. So you're sad, you're angry, you're worried, you're excited, you're frustrated, you're disappointed, you're upset. So you, feeling word, you can add an optional qualifier. So you're angry, the toy broke. You're frustrated, your sister took that from you. You're excited about the movies. So the qualifier is kind of the description. It is not required, however. It is just as effective to say, you're mad. But you can always add in the qualifier. Keep in mind, let's go back to a rule of thumb. If you can't say it in 10 words or less, don't say it. So the goal is to be very brief, very clear, and very concise because we don't want the feeling reflection to get lost in our words. So when we use this, we don't want to say, you're angry that the toy broke and then when the ladder fell off, you couldn't get it back on. And that totally defeats the purpose. So brevity is your friend. Try to keep it very concise, 10 words or less. So that is the reflecting feeling skill. That is one of the reflective responses. Reflecting content is the second of the reflective responses. So reflecting content is say what someone said to you. So when a child says something while they're playing, you rephrase and summarize and say it back to them. So reflecting their content back to them would look like child says, I'm going to pour this into this beaker. Now, before I give you an example of what you could say to reflect content, here are your challenges. You cannot parrot and say exactly back to the child what they said to you, or they get very upset and frustrated, understandably. So the goal is not to say exactly what they say back, because you sound like a robot or a parrot and they just don't like it and it breaks the connection. So you summarize and paraphrase what was said. So if they say, I'm going to pour this into the beaker, you might say, you're pouring that into there. So notice you're communicating, I heard you, I'm present, I'm accepting, I'm valuing, I'm engaged, I know what's going on. You just told me what you're going to do and I confirmed it back to you. Sometimes kids will go, yeah. And that is your verbal acknowledgement of, yes, we're on the same page. Sometimes they'll do that when you reflect their feeling as well. So sometimes you say, you're so proud that you did that. Yeah. Okay, so now we're both on the same page here. Sometimes you get no acknowledgement, and that's okay. You don't need to expect one or look for one. But when you reflect content, you're wanting to concisely say back to them what they've said to you. Now, that was a one-sentence reflection of content. What happens when a child gives you 8 minutes worth of dialogue and they're not playing, they're not moving, they're just sitting, talking, telling you a story? So that's a little different form of reflection of content because you're not going to every sentence say something back to them. So in a scenario like that, you condense information with a one-sentence summary. So think about Cliff's Notes, if you will, right? So you just gave me a paragraph worth of information. What can I sum that up into one sentence? What would that look like? So your goal is always to take everything they've told you and say it back to them in a very short paraphrased summary. That's reflecting content. That's the second option. So we have 3 reflective responses. The first is reflecting content. The second is first is reflecting feeling. Second is reflecting content. Third is tracking behavior. So tracking behavior, the easiest way to think about that is say what you see. So whatever the child is doing, you tell them what you see them doing. So this is more behavior and activity based. So you can kind of think of this in terms of it's behavior and activity based, it's word based or verbally based, or it's emotionally and feeling based. So those are your 3 channels through which you can reflectively respond. So tracking behavior looks like you're stacking cups. You've decided to jump rope. You're grabbing the baby and putting it in the stroller. So you just say what you see. Whatever the child is doing, you tell them what you've noticed. So those are your 3 reflective responses. Keep in mind, they are phrased differently. But here's what's important to know. When you're doing this during play sessions, it is your number one goal, aside from obviously using reflective responses appropriately, you want to put your own thoughts and feelings aside. And once you do that, once you get your thoughts and feelings off to the side, out of the way, then you pay close attention to the child's verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Okay, so think back to, and maybe some of you are in grad school right now. Maybe some of you are still in undergrad, and this is all a whole new world to you. Welcome. So glad you're here. Child-centered play therapy is the best thing you'll ever do. So glad you're here. But if for those of us that are a little further down the road in our careers, think back to grad school. What's one of the first things that we talked about when we were learning how to think about conducting therapy with any age client? I have no idea if you got it, but what I was going for was interference. So we have internal distractions, we have external distractions. What is going to interfere with the session? You have transference, you have countertransference, you have internal distractions. My head's thinking about what I'm going to eat for lunch. You have external distractions. I'm too cold in this room. I can hear music playing next door, whatever. So you have all of these things that can interfere with the counseling session. And we talk through that ad nauseum, really, right? Remember role playing? You sit down with your fellow student and they have to be the client and you have to be the therapist, and then you switch and it's really awkward and uncomfortable. And okay, but what was the point of it? To eliminate all of the interference that can get in the way. Okay, when we're thinking about reflective responding, we have to get our own thoughts and feelings out of the way because it will 100% interfere. We can't be thinking about later that day. We can't be thinking about how much you can't stand how mean this kid is to you. You can't be thinking about what this kid's parents said to you in the last consultation, and you have to work on the fact that he's so aggressive. And you can't be thinking about your broken heart. You can't be thinking about whatever might have your own thoughts and feelings in the session. You have to get them out of the way. And the goal becomes pay attention to the child's verbal and nonverbal behaviors. The verbal behaviors are going to be reflecting content. Tell them what they've told you. Their nonverbal behaviors are going to be tracking behavior, reflecting feelings, what they're saying, what they're emoting. Okay, so if we can get out of ourselves, get out of our own heads, put our own thoughts and feelings aside, that is when we are the most effective at reflectively responding. So what might this look like? I'm going to give you a scenario. So the child walks into the playroom, says, I know what I'm going to do first, jumps over to the shelves, and then grabs the bucket of Lincoln Logs. So that's the first 20 seconds of walking into the playroom. That's the scenario. I know what I'm going to do first, hops over to the shelves, grabs Lincoln Logs. Okay. So you can use all three in that scenario. So if we're going to track behavior, we're going to say, you're hopping all the way to the shelves. If we're going to reflect content, I know what I'm going to do first. You have a plan for your first thing. Tell them what they've told you. The reflecting feelings, this is actually an important aside. They've done studies even with seasoned, well-trained, well-practiced child-centered play therapists. And reflecting feeling is one of the skills that child-centered play therapists have the hardest time consistently using in the playroom. They can consistently track behavior, they can consistently reflect content, they can consistently set limits, give choices, encourage. There's all of these other things that we'll get to, I promise. But what they found is statistically reflecting feeling is one of the hardest skills and the one that's used the least frequently among even veteran child-centered play therapists. So it's important that you hone this skill. If you're new to the field, gosh, invest the time and the energy and the effort into becoming a reflector of feelings. Get that skill high up in your arsenal, because when we reflect a child's feeling, it does so many things for them, and we'll talk about that more. So that's just a challenge that all of us have to overcome. But in that moment, did you notice that I didn't give you the feeling that he was feeling? I just gave you the scenario on purpose. Why? Because you have to look at the child's face, you have to look at their eyes, you have to look at their facial expression to determine what it is that they're feeling. In that scenario, in my mind, he's excited. So I would say, you're excited because you know what you want to do. But that's the way I envisioned his facial expression as he gave me that dialogue and that exchange in the playroom. You might have envisioned that differently. So the goal is to be able to cue in to what the child is feeling and accurately reflect the feeling. Here's the great thing about play therapy. Here's the great thing about kids. If you track behavior incorrectly, if you reflect content incorrectly, or if you reflect feelings incorrectly, kids are happy to correct you and tell you what it is instead. So there's no real risk of getting it, quote, wrong, unless you're just absolutely not paying attention and you pull something out of a hat and it's totally off in left field, then that would not be therapeutically appropriate. But if you're actively trying and you get it a little bit wrong, a kid will just correct you. So there's no real fear of really screwing it up, but it's important to keep in mind when you reflect feeling, you have to be really tuned in. And that's why when we put our own thoughts and feelings aside, it allows us to pay attention to nonverbal behaviors. The eyes give you the clue, the tone of voice gives you the clue, the facial expressions give you the cue. You have to be actively paying attention to make this work. So here are some examples actually from the Van Fleet book that I want to share with you. So if the child is pouring water into some cups, the therapist says, you're pouring that into the cups. What skill is that? What reflective response is that? I heard you. Tracking behavior. Okay. If the child is smiling while pouring, the therapist says, you're really having fun pouring the water. Or you're happy to pour the water. I added that one. That wasn't in the book. You're really having fun or you're happy. Okay, what is that? That's reflecting feeling. Okay, if the child is frowning while pouring very cautiously, the therapist might say, "You're really concentrating on pouring the water. You're worried about spilling it." Reflecting feeling. Also a little bit of tracking behavior because you're watching them pour it very cautiously and concentrating. Okay, if the child says, "I'm going to pour this into here," your reflecting content would be, "You're going to pour it into there," because you say what they said to you. So the goal is choose the one that makes the most sense to communicate the things we talked about in the last episode. I value you. I accept you. The be with attitudes. I'm here. I hear you. I understand. I care. I delight in you. I'm present. I'm engaged. What matters to you matters to me. So if that's reflecting feelings, do that. If it's reflecting content, do that. If it's tracking behavior, do that. Sometimes all three are appropriate, so pick one. But the goal is always that the child feels safe to do the work that they need to do. So I hope that helps you understand the reflective responses options. That is the really most basic, helpful place to start. So if you are totally new to this field, or maybe you've been around for a long time, but you've never heard this talked about in this way, or you've never really used the reflective responding skills in your play sessions, this is the perfect place to start because it gives you 3 in 1. So if the child isn't saying anything and they're not emoting anything, but they're doing something, you track behavior. If the child isn't doing anything, they're just sitting there, but they're talking your ear off up a storm, then you reflect content. If the child has their back to you, you can't see what they're doing, they're not saying anything, but they're giggling, then you reflect their feeling. So it kind of gives you your little toolbox where you can say, okay, no matter what happens, I know how to respond in a therapeutic way to help the child feel all of those things that I want them to feel so that they feel safe to do the work that they need to do. It's amazing. And once you get it, once you see the power of it, once you watch it work, once you watch the impact that it has in your sessions, it makes you want to do it more and more and more. So I hope that encourages you. I hope that this podcast continues to inspire you to work at your craft, hone your skills, develop into an amazing child-centered play therapist. We need more of us. We need people that get kids, that get this approach, and that value the belief that kids are good and they just need the right environment to become even better. So I'm so grateful for y'all. Thank you for being a part of the Play Therapy Podcast. We'll talk again soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Play Therapy Podcast with Dr. Brenna Hicks. For more episodes and resources, please go to www.playtherapypodcast.com.